They found her 7 days after the garrison fell. Wren knew this because she was the one who found her. Senior Medic Thavani Wren, 4th Clinical Cohort, Veshan Interdiction Authority. She had been seconded to the recovery mission at Deathworld, a forward-listening post on the border of what the Council euphemistically called the contested threshold. 41 personnel had been stationed there. 40 were confirmed dead within the first 3 hours of the assault. 1 was not. The Drethvani had come through the outpost like a scythe through standing grain. Four-armed, methodical, their amber scholars' robes stained darker than ceremony could explain. They were an academic caste that had turned militant 2 cycles prior, and their campaign against the threshold stations had been prosecuted with the cold efficiency of a faculty purging its tenure rolls. They did not leave survivors. That was doctrine, not cruelty. Their war calculus simply had no variable for mercy. The recovery detail Wren accompanied was composed of 11 Veshan medics and a security escort of 30. They expected bodies. They expected wreckage. They expected to catalog the dead, seal the site, and file the clinical addendum that would let the Council close another border post from its active ledger. What they found instead broke every model she had been trained to trust. She was telling this now, from the sterile quiet of Clinical Archive 7, because 12 cycles had passed and the record still had not been corrected. What was filed says one thing. What Wren saw said another. The official tally lists 41 casualties at Deathworld. The truth is 40. And the difference between those 2 numbers is the reason 300 Drethvani scholars refused to cross the threshold again. Let me go back to the beginning. Not the assault, she had not been there for that. The aftermath. We landed at dawn. The outpost sat on a high plateau, a brutalist slab of sensor arrays and dormitory blocks overlooking a valley that ran southeast for 900 kilometers. The threshold sky was the color of heated copper that morning, and the air carried a chemical bite that made her secondary gills ache beneath the edges of her helmet seal. Deathworld had been designed for a garrison of 50, but never staffed above 41. A skeleton post, a tripwire on the Empire's cheapest wire. The damage was immediately apparent from the air. The main sensor dome had been peeled open from the north side. Its alloy petals curled back like something organic had bloomed through them from beneath. 2 of the 3 dormitory blocks were gutted, fire-blackened, open to the copper sky. The third stood intact but dark, its windows catching no light from inside. The landing pad was cratered in 4 places. The blast patterns precise enough to suggest the Drethvani had targeted the evacuation shuttles first, before anything else, before the killing even started. Her escort commander, a Veshan career officer named Dureth, took one look at the cratered pad and said, "They wanted no one leaving." He was right, but he was also wrong about why. They entered through the main corridor on the south face. The lights were dead, but their helmet lamps cut through the dark well enough to see the walls, scoring marks from bladed weapons at waist height, a fire suppression panel ripped from its housing and left on the floor. The first body was 12 meters inside, a Kalathi communications officer, face down, 4 parallel lacerations across her back consistent with Drethvani ceremonial blades. The cuts were deep and deliberate, not combat wounds. Execution marks. She knelt, ran the scanner, logged the injuries, flagged the time of death estimate at 7 days prior and moved on. That was her function. That was what she had been sent to do. By the time we reached the operations center, 30 minutes into the sweep, she had logged 9 more bodies. All showed the same pattern, precise, ritualistic wounds from bladed weapons. No ballistic damage, no plasma scoring. The Drethvani had done this with hand tools, short curved blades worn on the inner wrists of their lower arms, ceremonial instruments that their scholars called the vnori, which translates roughly as teaching edges. That was consistent with their doctrine. They believed that killing with purpose required proximity. That distance was the coward's variable. She had read their academic texts on the subject during her preparation for this deployment. The prose was meticulous. The philosophical rigor was considerable. The conclusions were monstrous. The operations center itself was a controlled ruin. Consoles shattered, their display panels cracked in patterns that suggested methodical strikes rather than random destruction. Data cores pulled from their housings and stacked neatly in a corner, the scholar's instinct to archive even what they killed for. The main tactical display had been smashed with what appeared to be a single blow from a heavy implement, but its frame still stood upright. And across the dead screen someone had drawn a glyph in what Ren recognized, with a cold knot settling behind her sternum, as dried blood. The glyph was Deathworld academic script. It read, "Lesson delivered." Dureth stood in front of it for a long moment, his mandibles clicking in the way that Veshin do when processing anger they cannot act on. Then he turned away and directed his team deeper into the complex. She followed, cataloging. The sweep continued through the afternoon. 17 bodies by midday, each one a variation on the same methodical violence. 23 by late afternoon. The eastern dormitory block yielded 11 more in quick succession. Some had died in their bunks during what had clearly been a rest cycle, the Deathworld moving through sleeping quarters with the same practiced efficiency they brought to everything. She found a Veshin junior analyst curled in a corner beside her bunk, sidearm still holstered on her belt. She had not had time to draw it. Her face was turned toward the wall, as though she had tried to look away from what was coming. 3 doors down, a Kalathi sensor technician was slumped face first at his workstation, hands still touching the console, 4 cuts across his upper back so precisely placed that they formed a diagonal pattern. He had been trying to send a signal. The console's log, which the data recovery specialist later extracted, showed a partial transmission, 9 characters of a standard distress code that had never completed. The signal had reached the station's antenna array and stopped there, because the array was already destroyed. 9 characters, less than half a call for help. That was how close the garrison had come. By the end of the first day, we had logged 37 dead. The complex was large for a border post, 3 dormitory blocks, an operations center, a communications wing, 2 maintenance bays, a small armory, a mess hall, and a medical section with its own isolated power cell. We had covered roughly 70% of the accessible space. The remaining areas were either structurally compromised or sealed. That was when Dureth's team reported the anomaly. Medical Bay, Section 4. His voice came through the corridor relay, tinged with the particular flatness that Veshin use when something does not match their operational assumptions. Doors sealed, not damaged, sealed. Welded shut from the inside. She was 3 corridors away, kneeling beside the 37th body, a Deathworld maintenance specialist who had died in a supply closet, his tool harness still clipped to his belt, 4 blade wounds to the torso. She logged the final injury entry, closed the clinical file, stood, and moved toward Section 4. The medical bay door was standard garrison issue reinforced composite designed to seal during atmospheric breaches, but someone had modified it. A heated tool had been run along the entire seam where the door met the frame, fusing the metal in a continuous, uneven, determined weld. Not elegant work, not pretty, functional. The kind of weld that says, I had 1 tool in 6 minutes and this door needed to hold indefinitely. The metal was discolored along the entire seam, the surface oxidized and rough, and when Ren pressed her scanner against it, the thermal signature indicated the fusion had been performed with a surgical cauterization unit, a tool designed for closing blood vessels, repurposed for closing a room. Dureth's engineers set up a cutting rig, 14 minutes. Ren stood in the corridor and listened to the saw working through the weld. The sound was high and steady, a keening vibration that traveled through the floor plates and up through the bones of her feet. Behind the door, nothing. No sound, no response to their hailing calls, No indication of whether the room beyond held another body or something else. The door fell inward. Wren was the third person into the room, behind Dureth and his point officer. Her helmet lamp swept the space. Surgical trays still racked on the right wall, their instruments visible through clear covers. Monitor banks along the left dead screens, but the housings intact, undamaged, no strike marks. Emergency lighting strips set into the floor casting a faint amber glow from the bay's independent power cell, still functioning after 7 days on reserve. The air was stale and cold, much colder than the corridors. The heating system had been destroyed in the assault, and this room had been sealed with only its emergency systems running for a week. She was sitting on the floor with her back against the base of the primary surgical table. A human. Small, that was the first clinical observation her training produced, automatic and involuntary. Significantly smaller than the surgical table behind her, smaller than the equipment cabinets flanking her, smaller than the scale of what she had done. Her hair was short and dark and matted with dust and dried perspiration, pressed flat against her skull on one side from sleeping on a hard floor. Her uniform, a standard-issue Terran Alliance medical technician's coverall, the kind with the red cross and crescent patch on the left sleeve, was torn at the shoulder where something had caught and pulled, and stained dark across the abdomen in a pattern consistent with carrying weight against the body. Not her blood. Wren determined that later. Her eyes were open, she was alive, and she was looking at us. She did not react when we entered, did not flinch at the cutting torch, did not startle at the sudden ingress of light and armed personnel and sound after 7 days of sealed silence. She sat with her hands resting on her knees, palms turned upward, and she looked at us with an expression Wren had spent 12 cycles trying to classify, and had never found the right physiological term for in any of the 9 species she had studied. It was not fear. It was not relief. It was not the vacant 1,000-meter stare of systemic neurological shock, though by every clinical metric she should have been deep in autonomic collapse. It was something closer to the look of a person who has finished a long and grueling calculation and arrived at an answer and is now simply waiting, with patience and without anxiety, for someone to ask what it is. "Medical technician," Dureth asked from the doorway, his voice carrying the same flat operational tone. She nodded once. A single precise movement. Specialist Cade, Ellen Cade, Keth Voron Medical Section. Her voice was flat, not empty flat, like a frequency tuned so precisely that it carries no harmonics, no overtones, no emotional coloring. Clean signal, no noise. Wren had heard Veshan patients speak that way after extreme neural loading, the voice the nervous system produces when it has run every subroutine it has and come out the other side with nothing left to modulate. In Wren's species, that voice preceded catatonic collapse by minutes. In the humans, she would learn, it preceded something entirely different. Wren crossed the room and knelt beside her. Clinical protocol. Assess the survivor. Check vitals, check cognition, check for wounds requiring immediate intervention. Her scanner showed elevated cortisol, significantly elevated, but controlled, not spiking. Moderate dehydration. Early-stage malnutrition consistent with 7 days without adequate caloric intake. Core temperature 2 degrees below her species baseline. Her pupils were responsive and symmetrical. Her heart rate was 58 beats per minute, low for a human under stress, but steady. Her respiration was deep and measured, the rhythm of someone who had decided, consciously and deliberately, how to use their oxygen and had maintained that decision for days. "Specialist Cade," Wren said. "I am Senior Medic Wren, 4th Clinical Cohort. We are a recovery team from Central Command. We are here to evacuate you." "I know," Cade said. "Are you injured?" "No. The blood on your uniform isn't mine." She noted this in the clinical log. Then she noticed what was behind her, and the log stopped mattering. Along the back wall of the medical bay, arranged in a precise row with their heads toward the wall and their feet toward the center of the room. 17 bodies lay in state. Veshan, Kalathi, Drethuri, mixed species, all garrison personnel based on their uniforms and identification tags. Each one had been laid flat on their back. Each one had their arms folded across their chest, hands placed one over the other. Each one had their eyes closed, which, for the Kalathi, whose eyelids do not close naturally in death, meant someone had manually positioned the membrane and held it until it stayed. And each one had been cleaned. Not fully. She had clearly worked with limited water and no proper mortuary supplies, but the worst of the blood had been wiped from their faces with strips of what she identified as surgical sheeting, torn into rags and used methodically. Their uniforms had been straightened and smoothed as much as the damage allowed, collars turned down, sleeves unrolled, fasteners closed where they remained functional. Where a uniform was too badly damaged to straighten, she had covered the worst of it with a folded surgical drape. 17 bodies, prepared for recovery, in a sealed room, alone in the dark and cold over 7 days. Ren looked at the row, she looked at the woman. The clinical part of my mind cataloged the effort involved. The combined body weight of 17 individuals of 3 different species, ranging from 40 to 120 kilograms. The physical labor of transporting, positioning, and cleaning, each one without assistance. The logistical challenge of performing this work in near darkness with a single helmet lamp and diminishing water reserves. The non-clinical part of my mind went very quiet and stayed there. "You did this," Ren said. "They deserve to be found properly," she said. That was all she said about it. In 12 cycles, through 3 debriefings, 4 clinical interviews, and 2 separate intelligence reviews, that sentence remained her entire explanation. They deserve to be found properly. Delivered without emphasis, without sentiment, without any indication that an alternative had ever occurred to her, as if it were self-evident, as if the suggestion that it might not be obvious were itself the thing that needed explaining. She wanted to be precise about what the human had done, because the official record omits it, and because it matters. The record says a survivor was recovered from the medical bay. It does not say what the survivor did during the 7 days between the assault and the recovery. It does not say what she carried, or how far, or why. The record is not inaccurate. It is simply incomplete in the way that records are incomplete when the people who write them cannot fit what happened into the form. When the Drethvani assault began, Specialist Cade had been in the medical bay treating a Kalathi technician named Tevin for a minor electrical burn to the left forearm. She used his name every time she mentioned him during the debrief, never the Kalathi, never the patient, always Tevin. The attack was sudden and total. The garrison's perimeter sensors had been jammed by a Drethvani signal suppression device, a standard opening move in their doctrine, equivalent to a lecturer calling for silence before beginning. The assault elements breached all 3 entry points simultaneously. The base commander's last order, transmitted over the internal relay 9 seconds before his death, was to seal all interior compartments and hold for reinforcement. There would be no reinforcement. The nearest Allied vessel was 41 hours out at maximum burn, and the partial distress code, those 9 characters, had never cleared the antenna array. No one was coming. No one knew. Cade sealed the medical bay. She sealed Tevin inside with her. He was the only other living person in her section when the doors closed. She told me this during the debrief, sitting in the evacuation shuttle's interview compartment wrapped in a thermal blanket, drinking water in small measured sips that she counted without appearing to count. She told me that Tevin had the burn on his forearm and a stress fracture in his right ankle from the previous week's maintenance rotation. She had been wrapping the ankle when the first explosion hit. Tevin died 4 hours after the assault ended. Not from his injuries, from a cardiac event. The Kalathi are physiologically fragile under sustained high cortisol conditions, and the sustained sounds of the assault reverberating through the sealed door had triggered a cascading autonomic failure. Cade attempted resuscitation for 31 minutes. She described the attempt in the same flat clinical terminology she used for everything. Compressions administered at species-appropriate rate and depth, airway maintained with manual positioning, pharmacological intervention attempted with the Bayes emergency adrenaline analog stocks. No response. Time of death estimated at 0417 local. She wrapped his ankle before she moved him to the row. Wren asked about this during the debrief, not understanding. The ankle was fractured, and he was dead, and she had wrapped it anyway. I hadn't finished, she said, as if the explanation were contained in those 3 words. She was alone after that. She waited 3 hours after the last sounds of fighting stopped. Then she used the cauterization tool to cut a small inspection hole in the door's lower panel, a hole just large enough to see through and listen through but too small for a hand. She watched the corridor for 30 minutes. Nothing moved. No sound. No light. The Drethvani were gone. Their doctrine was attack, execute, withdraw. The lesson was delivered. The classroom was empty. She unsealed the door. Not all the way, she cut the weld on the left side only, creating a gap she could squeeze through, but that would be difficult for a 4-armed Drethvani to exploit if they returned. She told me she had calculated the dimensions based on her own body width and the average upper torso width of a Drethvani scholar, adding a safety margin. She told me this as a clinical observation, not as a display of ingenuity. The corridor was dark. Her helmet lamp, found in the Bayes emergency locker, the one item she had not already used, cut a narrow cone through air that smelled of burned insulation and copper, and something else that Wren recognized from her own experience in recovery work and will not name. She moved through the complex alone, methodically. Room by room, corridor by corridor, checking every space she could access, stepping over debris and around structural failures and through evidence of what had happened. She was not looking for survivors. She told Wren this with a directness that the medic still recalled as one of the most precisely weighted sentences she had ever heard from any species. By the time I opened the first door and saw what was behind it, I knew there were no survivors. I was looking for the dead. Looking for them, not stumbling upon them, not being forced to confront them, not processing the reality of the loss. Looking, actively, with purpose, the way a medic looks for patients. Except these patients were beyond any treatment she could offer, and the treatment she offered instead was the only one left: dignity. She found 40 bodies, including Tevin. She could not carry them all to the medical bay. The complex was too large. Some of the corridors were blocked by structural damage, and she was one person small, malnourished after 2 days without food, operating in near-total darkness with no assistance and a water supply that she had already begun rationing with clinical precision. So she made a decision. She would carry the ones she could reach. 17 bodies, one at a time. The closest was 11 meters from the medical bay, a Veshan orderly who had died in the corridor outside the supply room. She carried him first. Then the Calathi sensor technician from the workstation, the one who had almost sent the signal. Then a Drethuri mechanic from the maintenance bay 1 section over. Then 2 more Veshan from the adjacent dormitory corridor. Each trip was a separate expedition into the dark, out through the gap in the door, down the corridor with the helmet lamp and the smell and the silence, locate the body, assess the weight and the path back, lift, carry, navigate. Each trip took between 20 and 40 minutes depending on the distance and the individual's body weight. Some she could carry in her arms. Others she had to drag on surgical sheeting pulled from the bay's dispensers, the sheeting wrapped under the torso and over the shoulders so the body would not roll off as she moved through corridors that were no longer level. 1. A Calathi security officer who weighed approximately 110 kilograms. She moved in stages, dragging him 10 meters at a time, resting between each effort. The helmet lamp propped against the wall to light the path while she used both hands and all of her weight to pull. She made 17 trips. She estimated the total physical effort at approximately 14 hours, spread across the first 3 days after the assault. She did not do it continuously. She rested between trips, returned to the medical bay to drink water in measured quantities, slept when her body demanded it, on the floor beside the growing row of dead. But she did not stop. She did not decide at any point during those 3 days that she had carried enough. She stopped at 17 because the 18th body was beyond a collapsed section of corridor that she could not safely pass, not because she had reached a limit of endurance or will. When she had finished carrying, she began cleaning. This took another full day. She tore surgical sheeting into strips, wetted them with small amounts of water from her reserve, and worked systematically from the first body she had placed in the row to the last. Face first, wiping away the blood and the dust and the dried fluids that violence leaves behind. Then the hands. Then the uniform straightened as much as the damage permitted. Then the arms folded. Then the eyes closed. For the Calathi, whose eyelids do not seal naturally in death, she used a thin strip of surgical adhesive along the membrane's edge to hold it in position. A technique she told me she had improvised on the second Calathi body, having failed to achieve a lasting closure on the first using manual pressure alone. Then she sealed the door again, re-welding the gap she had cut, and sat down with her back against the surgical table. And she waited. 4 more days. No food. The medical bay had no food stores, only pharmaceutical supplies and sterile water. The water lasted because she rationed it, 200 milliliters every 6 hours, measured in a graduated surgical beaker. She told me the exact volume during the debrief. She had counted. She had calculated how long her supply would last at that rate and determined that she had approximately 9 days before dehydration would begin to impair her cognitive function. She was found on day 7. She had margin. She had planned for margin. The temperature dropped to near freezing at night. The heating system was dead, and the medical bay's independent power cell ran only the emergency lighting strips and the air recycler. She had no blanket. She had used the surgical drapes to cover the damaged uniforms of the dead. She sat in amber half-light and dropping cold with 17 bodies arranged in a row behind her, and she waited for someone to come find them. She was not certain anyone would. She knew the distress signal had failed. She knew the Drethvani had cratered the landing pad. She knew that the garrison's scheduled check-in was not for another 2 weeks, and that border post check-ins were frequently delayed by administrative backlog. She sat with that uncertainty, the real, measured, calculated probability that no one was coming, and that she would die in this room with the dead she had carried for 4 days. And she maintained the same flat composure Ren found her in when we cut through the door. When she asked Cade what she thought about during those 4 days, she was quiet for a moment. The longest pause in the debrief, perhaps 5 seconds, which in the context of her machine-precise responses felt like geological time. "Their names," she said. She had memorized them, all 41. She recited them for me unprompted in the order she had found them during her sweep of the complex. Name, species, duty station, location of death. 41 entries delivered in a flat, steady voice without a single hesitation, a single error, a single moment where the clinical armor cracked and the weight beneath showed through. She checked afterward, cross-referencing against the garrison's personnel database. She had not missed one, not a name, not a duty station, not a location. She asked Cade why she had memorized them. "Someone should know them by name," she said, "not just by number. Someone should know them by name." She had included that sentence in 3 separate clinical publications, attributed to an unnamed patient. Each time, the reviewers flagged it as remarkable. Each time, she considered adding the context and decided against it, because the context, the dark room, the cold floor, the 17 bodies in a row, the 4 days of solitude and uncertainty, made the sentence too heavy for an academic paper to carry. The clinical debrief lasted 6 hours. She conducted it personally, over Dureth's repeated and increasingly frustrated objections. He wanted intelligence to handle the survivor interview. He argued that her knowledge of the garrison's layout and the Drethvani attack pattern had operational value that a clinical medic could not properly extract. Wren outranked him in medical matters, and Wren invoked clinical authority under Regulation 9173, and he backed down because the regulation was clear, and because he could see in her face that she was not going to yield. Cade sat in the shuttle's compartment, thermal blanket around her shoulders, surgical beaker of water in her hands, and answered every question Wren asked. Her responses were precise, sequential, and devoid of editorializing. She described the assault, the death of Tevin, the decision to carry the bodies, the 4 days of waiting. She described the cold in clinical terms, estimated ambient temperature, rate of thermal loss through the uniform fabric, the point at which she began shivering, and the point at which the shivering stopped, and she began a regimen of isometric muscle contractions to maintain core temperature. She described the dark. She described the smell. She described the sound of her own breathing in a sealed room, and the way the emergency lighting strips cast amber shadows that moved when she moved and held still when she held still, so that the shadows of the 17 bodies lay across the floor like a second row of dead that breathed when she breathed. She asked Cade if she had been afraid. She paused 4 seconds. Wren counted them against her chrono, because by that point in the debrief she had begun counting everything, the way she counted everything, as though precision were the only anchor either of us had. I was afraid the Drethvani would come back before anyone found them, she said. I didn't want the bodies disturbed. Not afraid for herself. Not afraid of dying alone in a cold room on a dead outpost on the far edge of the contested threshold. Afraid for the dead. Afraid that the care she had taken, the 14 hours of carrying, the day of cleaning, the adhesive on the Calathi eyelids, the folded arms, the straightened collars, would be undone before it could be witnessed. Her fear, the only fear she would admit to in 6 hours of debriefing, was that her work would not survive long enough to matter. She flagged that response in her clinical notes. In Veshan psychology, it would indicate a dissociative redirection, a mind routing its survival instinct onto an external fixation to avoid confronting its own terror. 3 Veshan colleagues reviewed my assessment. They concurred. Then Wren consulted a human psychologist stationed at Central Medical, Dr. Marin Vasic. Vasic read Wren's notes, read the full debrief transcript, and was quiet for a long time, long enough that Wren thought the connection had dropped. That's not dissociation, senior medic, she said. That's a value system. She asked Vasic to elaborate. She didn't redirect her survival instinct. She subordinated it. She decided that taking care of the dead was more important than her own fear, and she held that decision for 7 days without external reinforcement. That's not a psychological break. That's a load-bearing wall. A load-bearing wall. The part of the structure that holds everything else up, the part you do not see until it is gone and the rest collapses. Wren had thought about that phrase every day since. She asked Cade how she decided the order. Proximity, she said, closest first. Then I worked outward until I couldn't reach the next one. A pause. The 18th was Corporal Dashvin. He was in the West Maintenance Corridor, past the structural failure at Junction 7. The ceiling had come down in 3 places. I could see him through the gap, but I couldn't get a path through that was stable enough to carry weight. She had tried. She described 3 separate attempts to find a viable route, once through the corridor itself, crawling under a buckled support beam that shifted when she put weight on it, once through an adjacent service duct that turned out to be blocked by a collapsed ventilation panel, once through the maintenance level below, which was flooded with coolant from a ruptured heat exchanger. Each attempt had cost her time, energy, and water. Each attempt had failed. She had abandoned the effort after the 3rd, because she calculated that the risk of becoming trapped or injured exceeded her remaining margin for survival. She made the calculation. She accepted the result. She returned to the medical bay and sealed the door. She asked whether that decision troubled the human. Yes, she said, the simplest, most direct answer she had given in the entire debrief. No qualification, no clinical framing, just the word sitting in the air between us like a stone set down on a table. Wren waited. Cade did not elaborate. She noted in her log that this was the only question in 6 hours that she answered with a single, unmodified syllable. The evacuation shuttle departed Keth Voron at 14:20 local time, 7 days and 11 hours after the Drethvani had arrived. Specialist Cade walked to the shuttle under her own power. She refused the litter. She refused the assist from Durith's medics. She walked slowly, because 7 days of minimal caloric intake and near-freezing temperatures had taken a measurable toll on her musculature, but steadily, with the same controlled precision she applied to everything. She stopped at the shuttle's boarding ramp and turned back toward the outpost. Wren was walking beside her and saw the human's face in that moment, the copper light of the threshold sky catching the angles of it, the dust and grime still on her collar where she had not yet been cleaned up, the flatness of her expression unchanged from the moment they had found her. She looked at the outpost for 3 seconds. Wren knew because she counted. Then Cade turned, walked up the ramp, sat in the seat Wren indicated, and accepted the thermal blanket and the water. She did not look back again. During the 41-hour transit to Central Command, Wren monitored her vitals continuously. Her cortisol levels declined at a rate consistent with the removal of acute stressors. Her hydration improved with intravenous supplementation. She slept for 11 hours deep, dreamless sleep, according to the neural activity monitor, the kind of sleep that the body demands when it has been running on discipline alone and finally receives permission to stop. When she woke, she ate a standard ration meal with the same measured precision she drank water, small bites, thorough chewing, controlled pace. She finished the meal, placed the utensils neatly on the tray, squared the tray to the edge of the fold-down table and looked at me. "When can I return to duty?" she asked. Not when can I go home, not when will I see my family, when can she return to duty? Wren told her that mandatory post-incident psychological evaluation would be required before any duty clearance could be granted. She nodded once. She did not argue. She did not ask how long it would take. She accepted the requirement the way she accepted the water, as a practical fact with a practical implication. The psychological evaluation was conducted by Dr. Vasic over 4 sessions spanning 2 weeks. She was not present for the sessions, but Dr. Vasic shared her summary assessment with me under the clinical collaboration protocol. Her concluding note read, "Specialist Cade demonstrates no markers of post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative disorder, or acute stress reaction as defined by current Terran Alliance diagnostic criteria. She demonstrates persistent grief, which she manages through structured activity and professional routine. She is aware of this mechanism and considers it functional rather than avoidant. Recommend return to duty with quarterly monitoring." Note: existing interspecies trauma models do not adequately classify this presentation. The patient's coping mechanism is not suppression, it is integration. She has incorporated the event into her operational identity rather than walling it off. She carries the weight because she considers the weight part of the job. Carries the weight because she considers it part of the job. Dr. Vasic wrote that, and she read it, and she sat in her office at Central Command for a long time afterward, looking at the wall, thinking about load-bearing structures and what happens to a building when you try to remove one. She should note what happened to the 17 bodies. They were recovered by the detail in the order Specialist Cade had arranged them, transferred to sealed medical transports, and shipped to their respective species repatriation authorities. The process took 4 days. Wren supervised it personally, which was outside her assigned duties, but which she felt unable to delegate after what she had seen. The Calathi repatriation officer, a quiet, elderly female named Zenith who had been processing, recovered remains for 30 years. examined the 5 Kalathi bodies, and then came to find me. She stood in the corridor outside the processing bay, her chromatophores cycling through the slow gray-green pattern that Kalathi display when they are processing something that does not fit their expectations, and she asked me a question. Who prepared them? Ren told her. Zenith was quiet for a moment, her chromatophores settling into a steady pale blue that Ren did not have the cultural background to interpret. The eyelids, she said. Our dead do not close their eyes. Someone used medical adhesive along the membrane edge, precisely applied. No tearing, no excess. Whoever did this knew the anatomy, or learned it. She learned it, Ren said, on the first body. She told me she'd failed the first attempt and adjusted her technique for the second. Zenith looked at Ren. Her chromatophores went to a color Ren had never seen in a Kalathi, a deep, luminous violet that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the skin rather than the surface. The human did this in the dark, she said, alone, with no reference material for people who were not her species. Yes. Zenith was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I have processed the recovered remains of 4,000 personnel in my career. I have never received a body that was cared for by the enemy's survivor. I do not have a form for this. She filed the repatriation report with a handwritten addendum. The first handwritten addendum in 17 years of digital record-keeping, she told me later. The addendum read, Remains received in a condition consistent with formal mortuary preparation, performed under field conditions by a Terran Alliance medical technician who survived the assault and chose to prepare the dead rather than prioritize her own survival. This office formally notes the care taken. Ren had a copy of that addendum. She kept it in the same drawer as her clinical file from Deathworld, and she had read it more times than she had read the file itself, because the file contains data and the addendum contains something that data cannot hold. The Deathworld learned about Specialist Cade 48 days after the evacuation. The Council had released an official account of the Deathworld recovery standard procedure, a bureaucratic document meant to justify continued funding allocations for the Threshold Garrison program. The account was dry, technical, and buried in the kind of administrative language that ensures almost no one reads it. But it mentioned, in one line in the third appendix, under the heading Recovery Anomalies, that a sole survivor had been located in the medical bay, and that the bay had contained remains of 17 garrison personnel prepared for formal recovery by the surviving technician. Prepared for formal recovery. That was the phrase the Council used, as if she had been following a manual, as if there were a procedure for what she did. The Deathworld academic networks intercepted the report within hours. Their signal intelligence apparatus was, if nothing else, thorough. They maintained listening posts on every Council communication relay, and they parsed every official document for tactical and doctrinal relevance. The Deathworld report was flagged as routine. The line about the prepared remains was not. Within a week, that single detail had been extracted, translated, annotated, and circulated to every faculty in the Deathworld Military Philosophical College system. Within a month, Ren began receiving second-hand accounts of the response, forwarded through the Council's academic exchange channels by colleagues who monitored Deathworld publications for threat assessment. They were disturbed. She needed to be specific about this, because the common narrative is wrong. The version that filtered into popular culture, the one her colleagues repeat at conferences, the one that gets summarized in briefing documents as the Deathworld were impressed by the human survival, is a mischaracterization so fundamental that it inverts what actually happened. They were not impressed. They were not frightened. They were not humbled. They were theologically unsettled in a way that their philosophical tradition had no mechanism to process. The Deathworld academic tradition rests on a single axiom, foundational and unquestioned for 300 cycles, that war is a form of instruction. The attacker teaches, the defender receives. Victory is pedagogy, a proof delivered through force, as irrefutable as mathematics. When a garrison is destroyed, the lesson is conclusive. You are not strong enough, not prepared enough, not sufficient to the task of holding this ground. The dead are the evidence. The silence afterward is the grade. And if any survivors remain, they are the students who will carry the lesson forward, broken, diminished, permanently educated in their own inadequacy. Their glyph on the operations center screen, lesson delivered, was not mockery, not cruelty, not a boast. It was, within their philosophical framework, a factual annotation. The same way a professor writes exam graded on a completed assessment and files it. The lesson had been taught. The evidence was conclusive. The classroom was closed. Specialist Cade broke that framework. She did not fight the lesson. She did not refuse it. She did not counter-argue or prove the Deathworlders wrong on their own terms or demonstrate that humans were stronger or faster or more lethal than the scholars had calculated. She simply behaved as though the lesson were beside the point. She walked into the aftermath of their most rigorous instruction, the dead corridors, the execution marks, the blood-drawn glyph on the screen, and she began cleaning. She took the proof of their lesson, the 40 bodies that were supposed to be the conclusive, irrefutable evidence of Deathworlders' philosophical superiority, and she treated them as a logistical problem, a housekeeping matter. She folded arms. She wiped faces. She closed eyes that were not designed to close on their own, and used surgical adhesive to make them stay closed. She straightened uniforms and covered damaged fabric with clean drapes, and arranged 17 people in a careful row against a wall with their heads aligned, and their hands placed just so. And then she sat down in front of them and waited for someone to come collect them, as though the most significant thing the Ani had done was create an untidy workspace that needed setting to rights. The theological implications were devastating. If the lesson could be received and simply set aside, not argued, not challenged, not even consciously rejected but treated as background noise while the survivor attended to concerns she considered more pressing, then the axiom collapsed. War was not instructive. The dead were not proof. The silence afterward was not a grade. And the glyph on the screen, that careful, blood-drawn assertion of pedagogical completeness, was not a factual annotation. It was graffiti. And the one person left alive to read it had looked at it, walked past it, and started carrying bodies, because that was what needed doing and the glyph was not on her list. The first formal Deathworlders response came 40 days after the intelligence brief circulated. 3 senior scholars from the College of Applied Instruction published a joint paper in the college's primary theoretical journal. She obtained a translated copy through the Council's Academic Exchange Archive. The translation was clinical and precise, because the Deathworlders write the way they kill, with proximity to the point and no wasted motion. The central argument, stripped of its theological circumlocution, was this: we do not understand what we encountered at Deathworld. The survivor did not behave as a survivor. She behaved as a custodian. We have no pedagogical framework for a species that treats annihilation as an administrative inconvenience. Administrative inconvenience. They wrote those words with 4 hands and meant every one of them without irony. And the fact that she had quoted them in 4 separate publications, since does not diminish the impact they had when Wren first read them in a borrowed office at Central Command, while the copper light of the threshold sun came through the window, and the clinical file from Deathworld sat open on the desk beside me. A second paper followed 9 days later from a junior faculty member at a smaller Deathworld college. Its argument was narrower and, in certain ways, more unsettling. The author, a young scholar named Deathworld, who she later learned had been one of the Assault Elements Doctrine advisors, though not present at the attack itself, proposed that Specialist Cade's behavior constituted not a failure to receive the lesson, but a counter-lesson delivered to the Deathworlders through the condition of the dead. The argument was precise. By preparing the remains, the human communicated that our work was temporary and hers was not, that our violence was a transient disruption and her care was a permanent correction. She did not resist our lesson. She superseded it. The dead, which we intended as evidence of our thesis, became instead evidence of hers, that there exists a species for which the act of destruction is less significant than the act of restoration. This is not resilience. This is not endurance. This is a competing philosophical framework, and ours is not equipped to defeat it because it does not engage on our terms. Correction. A Drethvani junior scholar, a member of the same intellectual tradition that had designed the assault on Deathworld, used the word correction to describe what a lone human medical technician had done to 3 centuries of military theological doctrine by folding arms and closing eyes in a dark room. The high faculty took 60 days to respond. In Drethvani academic culture, 60 days is fast. Their deliberative process normally runs a full cycle for doctrinal amendments, and the fact that they compressed it by a factor of 6 tells you more about the impact of specialist Cade's behavior than any of the papers did. The amendment was 9 pages long, dense with theological notation and cross-references to foundational axioms that had not been modified in 200 cycles. Most of it was process, citations, justifications, the careful academic scaffolding that the Drethvani build around any change to ensure it looks like evolution rather than capitulation. But buried in the 7th page, in a clause that the Council's translators flagged with a quiet priority marker, was the operational core. Elements originating from or designated as category null whisper, colloquial, Deathworld origin, are hereby excluded from standard instructional engagement protocols. The lesson cannot be delivered to a student who does not recognize the classroom. The student who does not recognize the classroom. That was their phrase. Their official, doctrinally sanctioned, theologically grounded phrase for what specialist Ellen Cade was. The effect was immediate and measurable. Within 1 cycle, Drethvani attacks on threshold stations with confirmed human personnel dropped to 0. Cross-referenced against intelligence estimates of their force capability and campaign planning documents captured in a separate operation, this represented a voluntary withdrawal from approximately 40% of viable targets. They could have attacked. They chose not to, not from fear, not from weakness, but from the conclusion that the engagement served no pedagogical purpose. Within 2 cycles, they had withdrawn from the contested threshold entirely. The Military Philosophical College system published a long, dense retrospective analysis. She read every page that attributed the withdrawal to a concept they called pedagogical futility. The lesson could not be taught because the student would not recognize the classroom. The student would just clean up after the lesson and wait for the next appointment. 300 Drethvani scholars signed a formal acknowledgement of the withdrawal. She had seen the document. It is spare and uncomfortable and reads like a faculty admitting, in the most carefully hedged language their tradition allows, that they encountered something they cannot explain and have decided to leave it alone. Wren saw specialist Cade once more. 3 cycles after Deathworld, she had been reassigned to a medical station on the inner ring, a quiet posting, routine work, far from the threshold and its copper skies and its politics. Wren was attending an interspecies trauma response conference at the same station, presenting a paper on post-conflict survivor typology. She recognized Cade's name on the station's duty roster, while reviewing the facility directory the morning before her panel. She found her in the medical bay, naturally. Where else would she be? She was standing at a surgical tray, organizing instruments with the same precise, unhurried movement she remembered from that dark sealed room on the plateau. Each tool lifted, inspected, placed in its slot. The overhead lights were white and steady. The air was warm and clean and smelled of standard antiseptic. She looked the same, small, unremarkable, her hair slightly longer, The hollows under her eyes filled in, the dust and exhaustion and 7-day wait of Deathworld long gone. She looked like any other human medical technician on any other station in the Allied network. Nothing about her suggested anything other than routine clinical competence, practiced at a routine clinical pace. Ren stood in the doorway and watched her work for a moment before she turned. "Senior Medic Ren," she said, no surprise, no warmth or coldness, recognition. A fact registered, classified, and filed in its correct location, the same way she filed instruments, the same way she had filed the names of 41 dead. "Specialist Cade, are you here for the conference?" "Yes." She nodded once, that same single precise nod, and returned to her instruments. Ren watched her hands, steady, efficient, each tool in its slot, each slot in its tray, each tray squared to the counter's edge. The unconscious precision of someone who has organized 1,000 trays and will organize 1,000 more and does not find the repetition tedious, because the repetition is not repetition. It is maintenance. It is the daily act of keeping things in order. It is the work that holds everything else together. She wanted to ask Cade something. She had carried the question for 3 cycles, turning it the way a diagnostician turns a reading that will not resolve, looking for the angle, the context, the frame that would make the data fit a model she understood. The question was simple. It was the only one that mattered. And she had spent 3 cycles uncertain whether she had the right to ask it, or whether asking would be an intrusion into a space she had sealed as thoroughly as she had sealed that door. "Do you think about them?" Ren said. She did not look up from the tray. Her hands did not pause in their work, but something shifted behind her eyes, a depth, a weight, a gravitational density that the flat, calm surface of her expression held in place the way a frozen lake holds deep water beneath it. The surface did not crack. The ice did not break. But for one moment, standing in a bright, clean medical bay 3 cycles and 1,000 light years from Deathworld, she saw what was underneath. Not despair, not trauma. Something heavier than either. Something that had weight because she carried it willingly, and would carry it tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, because carrying was what she did. "Every day," she said. Then she placed the last instrument in its slot, squared the tray to the edge of the counter with a small, precise adjustment of 2 fingers, and turned to face me. "Is there something you need from medical, senior medic?" The conversation was over. The depth was sealed. The surface restored, calm, professional, operational, clean. She was a medical technician on a medical station, and she had instruments to organize and patients to see and work to do, and the work would be done correctly. The trays would be squared. The names would be remembered. The dead would be carried if they needed carrying. Because that was what she could do, and so she would do it, and she would keep doing it until there was nothing left to do, and she would not ask for recognition, and she would not ask to be understood, and she would not explain. Ren left the doorway. She attended the conference. She presented her paper. In the conclusion, she described, in careful clinical language, a category of resilience she had observed in exactly 1 patient, a category for which the existing Veshan models of trauma response offered no adequate classification. She did not name the patient. She did not describe the case in identifiable detail. She simply noted that the models were incomplete, and that further study was warranted, and that there existed, in the data, evidence of a structural capacity that their frameworks could not yet map. The paper was cited 14 times in the following cycle. Twice by Deathworld academics, who referenced it in their ongoing effort to understand what they had encountered at Deathworld and decided to leave alone. 12 cycles had passed. Deathworld is a decommissioned ruin on a high plateau, its sensor dome open to the copper winds, its corridors empty of everything except dust and the fading chemical smell of what happened there. The Deathworld have not crossed the contested threshold since their withdrawal, and their military philosophical colleges have turned to other axioms, quieter ones, she was told, with less certainty in them. The Council's official record still lists 41 casualties at the Deathworld garrison. Specialist Cade's name appears in no commendation, no citation, no historical summary of the Threshold conflict. She is a line in a personnel database. A medical technician who survived, because she happened to be in a sealable room when the worst thing that could happen did. That is the record. She was correcting it now, 12 cycles late because someone should. Not the assault that is documented. Not the politics, those belong to people who were never in the room. Just the part that matters, the part the form had no field for. 1 human, 17 bodies, 7 days. She carried them all.